Hi everybody, welcome to Christian Homestead. My name is Jared. If you haven't already, please make sure to subscribe. I recently came across this post on X by Mario Nafal that says Salt Lake City is on a quake time bomb. Now, this by itself is not exactly news. I grew up in the Salt Lake Valley, and we were always told about the big one that was coming, and that Salt Lake is overdue for a large earthquake. But it turns out that there's new information that's just come out in an article by SciTech Daily that says that the situation is much more dangerous than previously thought. And this immediately made me think about President Nelson when he was talking about the renovations to the Salt Lake Temple and how during an earthquake there would be no safer place in the Salt Lake Valley than in the Salt Lake Temple. And so I did the research. It turns out that he's referred to earthquakes a couple other times, including as far back as 1993. And this 1993 talk that I'm going to share with you in just a little bit, it actually seems to point forward to his own presidency into the year 2020. I was kind of shocked when I came across this. Okay, so let's go to the SciTech Daily article. It's called "The Next Earthquake is Long Overdue. New research reveals Wasatch Fault more dangerous than previously believed." This was published on May 17th. Okay. Utah's Wasatch Fault extends about 240 miles along the western edge of the Wasatch Mountains from southern Idaho to central Utah. It runs through Salt Lake City and other major population centers in the state. This fault is classified as a seismically active normal fault. Okay, and then we're going to hear from Shreed Heron, an assistant professor in USU's Department of Geosciences. Quote, "The dip angle of the sliding surface tends to be steep." So this right here, this is a key concept for this video. Okay, steep. Often between 45 to 90 degrees. The Wasatch Fault plunges toward the west at a steep angle at the surface in the Salt Lake City area. End quote. A steep angle could mean seismic activity may be dampened during an earthquake and spare inhabitants and buildings from much injury and damage on the surface. Okay, so that's good. So if you have a steep angle, it lessens, it softens, it dampens the effects of an earthquake. And that's the case with Salt Lake. So that's good, right? Well, it turns out, as we continue, quote, "But the 2020 Magna earthquake, which occurred at about 9 kilometers depth west of Salt Lake City, caused injuries and resulted in nearly $50 million in property damages." Let's pause right here because some of those damages were to the Salt Lake Temple when the angel Moroni dropped his trumpet, which I didn't even know was possible. And we know that this was a sign. When we go to my spreadsheet called Timeline Second Coming, we had this event occur, which was 78 days into the year. So the day before that was 77 days. But it was 2 days after that that the missionaries were called home. And then 3 days later, all temples worldwide were closed due to the pandemic. There's a lot of people that would say, oh, there's no relationship here. You're looking too much into it. I don't think so. Imagine if you were President Nelson, president of the church, and this happens at the same time that the COVID-19 pandemic starts entering the United States and as businesses and public areas start to get shut down. It's very interesting timing. I don't think that is just a coincidence. But anyway, back to the article. It was a wake-up call. We wanted to understand how and why it happened at such a shallow depth, if the Wasatch Fault dips so steeply at the surface. End quote. With USU Geosciences Associate Professor Alexis Alt and doctoral student Jordan Jensen, Shreed Heron has published new findings about why earthquakes occur along the Wasatch Fault and why communities along the fault are more vulnerable to earthquake damage than previously thought. Quote, although the Wasatch Fault dips sharply at Salt Lake City, it curves more gently at depth as it moves west and is probably oriented at a much shallower angle at earthquake depth than expected. This means that an earthquake rupture could lead to stronger, more intense shaking at the surface, meaning a greater chance of injury and destruction. Further, the scientists discovered earthquake slip is possible along the shallowly dipping portion of the Wasatch Fault because the fault rocks themselves are much weaker, worn down, and slicker than the surrounding undamaged rock. Okay, so they have a shallower angle and you have this worn down, slicker rock. And so therefore, a greater chance for injury and destruction. Okay, so I wanted to go find that talk by President Nelson where he was talking about the Salt Lake Temple being the safest place in the Salt Lake Valley. So I went to the Scripture Citation Index, I looked up the word earthquake, and I narrowed it down to President Nelson's talks. And there were 3 that showed up. And so I decided to look at all 3 of them. There's one all the way back in 1993 when he was in the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. This was the October 1993 General Conference. So let's do this in order. We'll read this one and then his talk from the October 2020 General Conference, and then we'll finish off with the October 2021 General Conference. All right, he says, prior to my call to full-time service as a church leader, I worked as a medical doctor specializing in the teaching, research, and practice of thoracic and cardiovascular surgery. I performed about 7,000 operations. Oh, look at that. 7,000. Sorry, President Nelson in his sevens. I'm sure that has meaning to him. You know, I think I'm going to add that one to President Nelson's sevens. Okay. During nearly 4 decades as a student of medical sciences, I learned to distinguish between the physical and spiritual components of the human soul. A patient could be physically weak, but spiritually strong, and vice versa. For example, on many occasions, I watched the critically ill mobilize great spiritual strength in order to undergo a high-risk operation to correct a physical problem within the heart. In contrast, I saw individuals without physical abnormality who were seriously ill because of spiritual loss of heart. Duties have taken me to approximately 100 nations of the earth, where I have observed the physical and spiritual dualism of life on a broader scale. There I have noted examples of the same physical and spiritual disparity that I previously encountered in my profession. I've observed that if a great physical disaster should strike, such as a devastating earthquake or flood, people are motivated spiritually by an uncommon desire to help one another. After the great earthquake in Armenia in December 1988, for example, I saw spontaneous outpourings of help from all over the world. Donors from many nations contributed aid to hundreds of thousands of homeless victims. Generosity seemed to transcend political or racial differences. Fortunately, such major disasters are rare, but unfortunately, when normal life resumes, the pendulum seems to swing from spiritual vitality to laxity. It is ironic that as affluence and physical comforts increase, spiritual strength declines. This observation has prompted the title for my message. Now listen to this, especially in light of the next couple talks that we're about to read, the next of which is from the year 2020. And at that time, President Nelson is president of the church. The title for my message, Combating Spiritual Drift, Our Global Pandemic. Reversing this crisis in the health of the human spirit is an enormous challenge. So I just think that it's interesting that he's talking about physical and spiritual challenges, strength and weakness, and he's talking about earthquakes here. And then later on, he gives the title of his talk in the talk, which I'm not sure that I've seen that before, where the speaker is like, this talk is called, whatever it is. In this case, Combating Spiritual Drift, Our Global Pandemic. So, according to him, there was already, and I think it's probably even worse now, a global pandemic when it comes to spiritual matters. And little did he know, or who knows, maybe he did know, that there would be a global pandemic when he became president of the church, a physical one. So that's a good segue to the next talk. This is from the October 2020 General Conference, Embrace the Future with Faith, because a lot of people were scared in 2020, and there were a lot of issues going on, a lot of contention. Even though this was an actual physical pandemic, I think a lot of people were having spiritual trials during that year. Okay, so now, as president of the church, he says this. Now, grandeur may not be the word you would choose to describe these past few months. How are we to deal with both the somber prophecies and the glorious pronouncements about our day? The Lord told us how with simple but stunning reassurance. If ye are prepared, ye shall not fear. What a promise. It is one that can literally change the way we see our future. I recently heard a woman of deep testimony admit that the pandemic, combined with an earthquake in the Salt Lake Valley, had helped her realize she was not as prepared as she thought she was. So, you guys, this was 5 years ago. And I think that just as, what usually happens is you have something that's shocking that happens, like the pandemic or the earthquake, and then you get through it. And then if you're not careful, you become complacent. And in this case, I feel like this could be a warning of things to come. This could be a preview of the great earthquake that's coming to the Salt Lake Valley and or to the world, because we know that when Christ comes to the Jews on the Mount of Olives, there's going to be a worldwide earthquake, which may be the very same earthquake that affects the Salt Lake Valley, and is the earthquake that the church is maybe getting prepared for with the renovation of the Salt Lake Temple. So this is really powerful. The pandemic combined with an earthquake in the Salt Lake Valley had helped her realize she was not as prepared as she thought she was. When I asked her whether she was referring to her food storage or her testimony, she smiled and said, yes. If preparation is our key to embracing this dispensation in our future with faith, how can we best prepare? For decades, the Lord's prophets have urged us to store food, water, and financial reserves for a time of need. The current pandemic has reinforced the wisdom of that counsel. I urge you to take steps to be temporarily prepared. But I'm even more concerned about your spiritual and emotional preparation. In that regard, we can learn a lot from Captain Moroni. I find it really interesting that he would bring up Moroni after talking about the earthquake in the Salt Lake Valley that caused the statue of the angel Moroni on top of the Salt Lake Temple to drop his trumpet. Maybe a little hint to those that have eyes to see and ears to hear, that we're already thinking about the significance of this event. In that regard, we can learn a lot from Captain Moroni. As commander of the Nephite armies, he faced opposing forces that were stronger, greater in number, and meaner. So Moroni prepared his people in 3 essential ways. First, he helped them create areas where they could be safe, places of security, he called them. Second, he prepared the minds of the people to be faithful unto the Lord. And third, he never stopped preparing his people, physically or spiritually. So you guys, we need to do both. There's so many times in the comments section that people will say, well, why don't you focus on this instead of that? And my question is, why not focus on both of them? We should focus on temporal preparedness as well as spiritual preparedness. Do them both. Ultimately, being spiritually prepared is more important because that's what's going to affect you in the eternities. But it doesn't have to be one or the other. It's both. And finally, Let's go to the October 2021 General Conference. This is President Nelson's talk called The Temple and Your Spiritual Foundation. And to each of you who has made temple covenants, I plead with you to seek prayerfully and consistently to understand temple covenants and ordinances. Spiritual doors will open. You will learn how to part the veil between heaven and earth, how to ask for God's angels to attend you, and how better to receive direction from heaven. By the way, these are highlights from a previous video. Your diligent efforts to do so will reinforce and strengthen your spiritual foundation. My dear brothers and sisters, when renovations on the Salt Lake Temple are completed, which, by the way, I think the renovations themselves will be done by the end of the year 2026, and then the open house is from April to October of 2027. So I don't know if maybe this is a hint to us, but when the renovations on the Salt Lake Temple are completed, there will be no safer place, in italics, no safer place during an earthquake in the Salt Lake Valley than inside that temple. Likewise, whenever any kind of upheaval occurs in your life, the safest place to be spiritually is living inside your temple covenants. Please believe me when I say that when your spiritual foundation is built solidly upon Jesus Christ, you have no need to fear. As you are true to your covenants made in the temple, you'll be strengthened by his power. Then, when spiritual earthquakes occur, you'll be able to stand strong because your spiritual foundation is solid and immovable. The last thing I'd like to talk about is on my spreadsheet called Quotes A through Z. This is currently row 144 for Earth Millennial. Now, I'll be interested to see if the Salt Lake Valley has a separate earthquake before the big worldwide earthquake, or if all this preparation and stuff that we're talking about is simply for the worldwide earthquake. But let me just read a couple quotes. They're both from Elder Bruce R. McConkie. This one is from Doctrinal New Testament Commentary, Volume 3, page 543. 3 natural changes in the earth, all apparently growing out of one transcendent happening, which I think is the earthquake, are here named as attending our Lord's second coming. They are, number 1, Earth's land masses shall unite, islands and continents shall become one land, which I'm sure would entail an earthquake or earthquakes. Number 2, every valley shall be exalted and every mountain shall be made low, and the rugged terrain of today shall level out into a millennial garden. Number 3, such an earthquake as has never been known since man's foot was planted on this planet shall attend these changes in the earth's surface and appearance. And fourthly, as recorded elsewhere, the great deep, presumably the Atlantic Ocean, shall return to its place in the north, and the earth shall be like it was in the days before it was divided. So, with the second coming and the millennium, there's a lot of changes that are going to take place to planet Earth, including possibly this. This is from his book called The Millennial Messiah, pages 413 to 416. But I think I just want to read this part right here. Okay, seed time and harvest, in the sense of one season following another, exists because the axis of the earth is tilted 23.5 degrees from the upright. This is the reason we have summer and winter, spring and fall. The first reference in the scriptures to seasons as we know them is in connection with the flood of Noah. There is a presumption that prior to the flood, there were no seasons because the axis of the earth was upright, and a similar presumption that when the millennium comes and the earth returns to its original paradisiacal state, once again, the seasons as we know them will cease, and that seed time and harvest will go on concurrently at all times. Now, he does say that this is his speculation, I think later on, but that's also something that would be a dramatic change to the earth. If it loses its tilt and is perfectly upright before the sun, which I feel like there's a lot of good symbolism behind that, it kind of makes sense to me. But maybe all these things happen at the exact same time. It's just a very big, violent event that causes a large earthquake and or other earthquakes that go along with it. So I don't know. It's just interesting stuff. President Nelson may not know exactly what's going to happen, if there's going to be like a big Salt Lake earthquake and then after that a worldwide earthquake later on, or if it's just one and the same. There's just like one big worldwide earthquake. But it's pretty clear that he's been being inspired to do it by someone who does know what's going to happen. And we're just finding out now that if there is a Salt Lake earthquake, well, I guess even if there's the worldwide earthquake, it's probably going to be much more dangerous than what we thought for the Wasatch Front. So I don't mean to be the bearer of bad news if you live in these areas. I would say just be prepared, first spiritually, and then secondly, be temporally prepared. And just remember, again, there are no longer mobs here in Missouri, so if you feel prompted, you can always come back to Missouri. But anyway, let's just take note of these things and do our best. But that's going to be for this one, so if you haven't already, please make sure to subscribe, like this video if you liked it, leave your thoughts and opinions down in the comments below. Also make sure to share it, and I'll talk to you guys later.